Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and it is time. It is time for my LTA North Finals overview and analysis video, and we've done a couple Finals videos up until this point for some of the other regions. Of course, we've covered everything here in the LTA as per normal, but this one means a little bit more because unlike a lot of the other regions where Finals is really just for the banner, for the championship, this is, of course, still for the banner, for the championship that these teams really want to acquire. Winning domestically still matters to basically everybody, but unlike the other regions where all these teams had already qualified for MSI, this is for a spot at MSI because only one team from the LTA North gets to represent their region at the midseason invitational. So this might be the most impactful finals of any region in the entire world right now, and that makes it very, very exciting. I'm excited. I hope you guys are as well. Let me know what you thought of this series down in the comments section below. Did you expect everything to go the way that it did? Were you surprised by the outcomes? Did anything stand out in a good or a bad way to you throughout this series? I'm always curious to know where you guys land on a lot of those issues, but without further ado, let's get into the content itself. If you are new here, what we're going to do is go game by game, talking about the advantages and disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the game and a dud of the game for each game that we cover, and at the end of the series, I will be giving a player of the series, or in this case, a finals MVP to tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. Nothing to preview at the end of this because, of course, it is the final series of the spring split here in the LTA North. The winner goes on to represent their region at home in Canada for MSI, and the loser has to wait until summer in order to get their action back. So without further ado, let's get into the content itself. You can see it up on your screen. Now, this is a matchup between pretty undoubtedly the two best teams in the LTA at the current moment, the number 1 seeded FlyQuest and the number 2 seeded Cloud9. The reason I can say with confidence that these are the two best teams in the LTA is because they really have not had any challengers for the most part throughout this year. It's really just been Cloud9 who's had some ups and downs. FlyQuest obviously took some time to get going in the winter split. You could, kind of take a look at that 4th place finish and be like, maybe they haven't necessarily proven that they're great, but winter has already proven itself to be more of a preseason than anything else in almost every single region in the world, with so many of the teams that did well in winter underperforming throughout the rest of the year. But these are the two teams that separated themselves throughout the entirety of the spring split. To me, FlyQuest has clearly been the best team in the LTA basically since the beginning of spring. I think you're looking at a roster that has no excuses for not being the best team in the LTA. Like, on paper, they're certainly the most talented, at least in my opinion. I don't really think you can make an argument for any other team in the league. Inspired is arguably the best player in the entire league, just in terms of raw skill and, overall rating, if you wanted to put it that way. He's been so successful no matter the circumstance. You can maybe criticize the style of play that he ends up using to get there, but it's been successful not only domestically but internationally as well, and so you feel pretty good about Inspired. And then you're looking at maybe the best top laner in the league, although this is definitely a matchup between the two best in Bwipo on the top side. Quad, who's maybe the best mid laner in the league, especially in terms of just raw mechanics. You can, argue and dispute whether or not his mental and his macro is always there in terms of the mid lane position, especially in comparison to some other players at this level, but from a raw, hands perspective, yeah, he's probably number 1. He's right up there with Quid and with Loki. And then Masu and Busio, who have been really great. Masu's one of the best team fighters in the entire region. I think he's indexed really heavily into that regard. He might not be the most dominant laner, but he's super good in the back half of the game, and he still is a great laner. He's still a top 3 laner in the league. He's just a top 1 team fighter in terms of, all players, not just his position. And Busio was my MVP pick over the course of the regular season. That's how important I thought he was to the success of what FlyQuest is doing, really emerging as an upper tier player at the LTA level. FlyQuest is just really, really good, and I think the big thing for them is that they won this matchup last time these two teams played. Yes, it went to 5, and yes, it was incredibly close. Both teams put up a really good fight, but FlyQuest was able to come out on top despite their own interventions at times with their drafts trying to keep them behind. So, they're obviously coming in here as favorites. They were my projection to win this series 3-2, but I do believe that there is a lot of hype right now surrounding Cloud9, and there's no reason to believe this team does not have the skill level to be able to win this series. I think that they are right, but a half a tier below FlyQuest. Maybe not even that much. Maybe a quarter of a tier, 0.10, percent or whatever below FlyQuest. They're very, very close is the point I'm trying to make. Obviously, they're not coming off quite as much momentum. FlyQuest has basically been undefeated throughout a lot of the spring split, despite a couple of hiccups. One against Cloud9, of course, but they were able to beat C9 in the number 1 seed qualification series, and then they beat them again in winners finals, and so Cloud9 really kind of have to bounce back mentally from both of those losses. I think the concerning traits that they have are still definitely there. I think this team looks significantly worse when players like Blabber are on something more aggressive. I think you want to try and get to a spot or a position in this series where you can just allow your solo laners, your imports to really take over the game, because at the end of the day, they've been the ones that have been stable and carrying games for C9. Thanatos has a huge conversation for being the best top laner in North America. In fact, I would probably lean towards that right now. Even if I thought Bwipo was more valuable across the spring split, I think Thanatos, especially mechanically speaking, is just untouchable in the top lane position, a role that's pretty weak right now. Bwipo is going to have to make his case in this series that he deserves to be considered #1, but I cannot wait for that matchup. And then you've got someone like Loki in the mid lane, who I've been very high on in terms of his production over the course of spring. Wasn't high on him coming into the year. I thought he was just going to be this facilitative type of mid laner that wanted to play for Blabber to carry once more, because that just seemed to be the strategy Cloud9 wanted to play for ever since Blabber started breaking out and winning a lot of these MVPs, regardless of whether or not he was doing that on carry champions in the first place. However, Loki has impressed me so much as a carry. This really wasn't who he was in the Challengers League when he was playing over in the LCKCL. He's come over here from HLE's Challengers team and just been like a primary carry option. He was my first team all-pro mid laner over someone like Quad, and I know that's not the most popular opinion in the world, but I really do believe Loki has been that good for C9. Sven and Vulcan are definitely in form. They've been the most consistent bot lane in the entire league. Even if Busio, to me, has been the best like bot lane player, quote unquote, in the entire league, Sven and Vulcan as a duo are just never really losing. Vulcan is clearly support #2, in my opinion. Shout out Busio, he's been awesome, but yeah, I think Vulcan's been better than Core JJ for Team Liquid, and I think I would put him, almost half a tier, if not a full tier above where everyone else is right now, so I'm excited for that matchup against Sven. It's been hyper consistent, and he started carrying games. A big concerning trait, though, Sven was not good enough in his hyper carry game of game #5 when he was on the Zeri to really be able to push this team forward. It was really the only game where they actively played towards Sven. If that's going to be something that is kind of taken off the board, if he can't be a primary option, that puts even more of a responsibility on players like Thanatos and Loki to actually be able to step up. But if Sven can come out here and be the better AD carry between him and Masu, which I certainly don't think is out of the realm of possibility, then things open up a lot for Cloud9. So I'm very interested to see where the series goes. Like I said earlier, I predicted the series to go FlyQuest way 3-2. That was what I said in the last video, the semifinals video that I ended up posting. We will see how accurate I get in that regard. But the only way to know, of course, is to go game by game, and that means starting with game #1. So without further ado, let's get into it. The winner of game #1 was FlyQuest. They are going to take game #1. They're going to go up in this series 1-0, and they looked awesome here in game #1. I think you can talk about Cloud9 actually holding a foothold for a little bit of time in this game, mostly because a lot of gold ended up going onto Sven and onto his Varus. His positioning was really fantastic throughout this game, but it just didn't end up mattering. Masu was incredible on the Kaisa, and of course, you had a lot of setup coming in from the side of Busio, from the side of Inspired. Quad, I think, had a really good game. Bwipo was pretty solid on the Renekton, certainly the better top laner at the very least in game #1. There's a lot to like about what went down for FlyQuest, and not as much to like about what went down for Cloud9. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Again, if you didn't watch the semifinals video, or if you haven't watched any of the other game-by-game breakdowns that we do here, we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about my opinions of the draft, and then kind of get into whether or not that played out in terms of the game, or did not play out in terms of the game. And at least in game 1's case, I don't think it necessarily played out like I would expect from draft. I kind of like Cloud9's draft a little bit more. FlyQuest drafting, what your mind's eye pictures when you say like professional League of Legends draft. It's Azir Kaisa as the carry duo, Sejuani, Renekton on the top side. The only little spicy pick kind of thrown in there is going to be the Nico in the support position. But even then, like, Nico's become very ubiquitous with like top tier support play in 2025. But this is, a comp that if it was drafted in 2019, it would be just as relevant as it is now. Like, it's just, these champions have always been near the top of their roles. And Cloud9 on the other end, I actually do think have a lot going for them. While FlyQuest is indexing pretty heavily into playing late game team fights, that's naturally what you want to do when you have so much engage with the Nico, and even the front line of the Sejuani obviously getting tankier and tankier throughout the game, alongside these like duo hyper carries in Azir and Kaisa. I think Cloud9 scales just as well in terms of the damage coming out, and I would argue that their engage is more consistent. I think that they have a lot of ways to be able to start fights here with the Rel and the Wukong, probably the two best engaged threats in the entire game. A lot of pressure is kind of on Busio to be able to start fights for Fly. I think C9 just have more options. That on top of the fact that I do think you have multiple winning lanes for Cloud9. I think think Silas is very good into Azir early, should be able to pressure him off a lot of the major skirmishes and major fights that are going down. That opens up a lot of space for Wukong to be more aggressive, and Sejuani can't really match that if Wukong is going to have tempo through the middle of the map, which I think theoretically should happen in this game. And then Varus Rel absolutely should be able to dominate the 2v2 against Kai'Sa Neeko just because of the range advantage that Varus generally has. And so you're looking at a situation where, yeah, FlyQuest scales really well, but I think Cloud9 also scales really well. That's adding on top of something like a Rumble Equalizer in the late game. I think they have more consistent engage, and I think they have a couple of winning lanes. I would have favored Cloud9 coming out of this draft, but at the end of the day, FlyQuest just executed on this draft a lot better. They were able to generate a pretty decent lead throughout the mid game and then ended up running away with things. Masu, like I said, is going to get player of the game, and that's really the big turning point for me in terms of how this game went down, is that Masu just was spectacular in the back half, and we talked about this kind of in the preamble, the pre-show, if you will, here for Fly, but Masu is such a good team fighter. I think you could even make the argument he's the best team fighter of anybody in the LTA. He's certainly in that conversation. Sven is also in that conversation because he's been super consistent in that phase of the game, but Masu is just built for these 5v5s, especially on these hyper carries. His Kai'Sa reminded me and a lot of people of that Gen G series from Worlds last year where he ended up being absolutely excellent for the team. He just was in perfect position. His positioning was great. He was aggressive when he needed to be, and he was dealing a ton of damage. While there might not be a lot of setup on the side of FlyQuest, if you can still follow through, if you're dealing more damage than the enemy, that's all that really matters at the end of the day. The setup is just there to make it a little bit easier for Masu to be able to play the game. If he's going to step up and dominate either way, it doesn't really matter. But again, I do also want to give a lot of credit to the supportive pieces, kind of the setup pieces here, inspired on the Sejuani and Busio on the Neeko. I think both of them ended up playing really well to be able to let this Kai'Sa kind of run shop in the later part of this game. And even when Sven was getting resources off of, Busio, off of Whippo on the top side with this Renekton, it never really ended up transitioning into anything for the Varus because Masu was just always enabled just a tad bit more. And I think credit does go to a lot of the supportive pieces because, again, it is harder for them than it is for Cloud9 with this draft. Whippo and Quad were also pretty solid. We're going to talk about Thanatos. He had a pretty miserable game in this one from my perspective. A couple of major mechanical mistakes that I just don't think are super repeatable for him. He's always been a player that's been pretty consistent, all things considered, and so to see him kind of mess up in a couple of these fights is definitely disappointing, and again, we'll get to that, but Whippo was pretty solid on the Renekton, not really all that important towards this comp as a whole, and Quad did his job as that secondary carry on the Azir after Masu ended up getting targeted a bit more at the beginning of these fights and had to stay a bit more patient. So, credit to FlyQuest. I think they came out here and drafted something very comfortable, something that these players have obviously played a lot of over the course of their careers, and they executed on it, and they played around their strengths. I think getting Masu into a hyper carry teamfight win condition was really solid. For Cloud9, at the end of the day, it really just comes down to being a bit more clean on these executions. I really do think that that was the big difference here. You weren't exactly out of this game by any stretch of the imagination. You just never were in the driver's seat, like in full control, and I think part of that ends up being the early game, but a lot of that ends up being just the execution down the stretch. That's why Thanatos is getting done of the game for me. Unfortunately, I think this guy might have missed every single equalizer he went for in the back half of this game, which is just never a great sign. He was landing a couple of ticks of it, but just inoptimal, we'll just say, and he was really far behind in terms of gold and resources as well on the Rumble. One of the big reasons why I think Cloud9 can keep up in terms of scaling with an Azir Kai'Sa-led comp on the other side, even though you're, carry duo with Silas and Varus and these champions that might not be considered as dominant in the back half of the game, is because you have that Rumble equalizer and just Rumble in general to be able to go up against something like a Renekton. You should actually just have an extra relevant man in a lot of these fights, but if Thanatos is not going to be useful, if he's not going to be able to deal a lot of damage, that is a problem. Speaking of dealing not a lot of damage, Loki in the mid lane on this Silas never really got going either. I think this was a really good job by FlyQuest to be able to put resources into making sure Loki was not able to take over the game. Again, if you can win through Silas in the middle of the map and get the Wukong out moving and just kind of get everything rolling in that, vein, I think Cloud9 actually have a pretty easy job to be able to set things up. But I think Loki ended up just playing really horrible in this game. He was, I believe, lowest damage outside of Vulcan on the entire team, including Blabber on the Wukong, which is never really an ideal place to be for something like Silas in a matchup that I think is pretty positive overall for him. So, solo laners were kind of the key to victory for Cloud9, at least in game number 1. They were the reason that they ended up losing and kind of let them down. Blabber also needs to be better on the Wukong. Again, playing through mid lane in the middle of the map in general is something that he needs to push forward. It's not just, Loki wins or Loki loses. It's Blabber needs to kind of impact the game in that regard. That's his job. Sven and Vulcan were great here. Sven, in particular, was really great here in game number 1, but it just did not matter. Masu was a tad bit more relevant on the other side, certainly got to deal a bit more damage and ended up walking out with the the win because of it, but it's just game number 1. We get to move into the rest of the series. If Cloud9 can tie things up at 1 apiece, we just enter a best of 3, which we know either of these teams can absolutely win in any given situation. For FlyQuest, on the other side, though, if you can pick up that game 2 win and go 2-0 in this series, Cloud9 having to win 3 games in a row against FlyQuest is just a really hard thing to imagine. It's possible, but it's certainly not ideal. So who's going to be able to take it? Well, the winner of game number 2 was Cloud9. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to even up the series at 1 apiece, and they looked pretty damn good in doing so. This was a really, really nice game from them. I think that there were some mistakes, more so than the KDA would necessarily indicate. It wasn't exactly a perfect game, but part of that was that FlyQuest was actually playing pretty well in terms of their advantages in this game, or even just like the small neutral game states, and it just didn't matter. Cloud9 was definitely out executing them in a lot of really big instances, so credit to them. I actually think they played really, really well here in game number 2, and I think what we're seeing here is that this is definitely going to be a fun one between these two teams. That's kind of been the case throughout this entire year, basically every single time these two organizations faced off against each other, and I think most encouragingly for me, I think this shows that both of them are really good, and generally we've kind of already known that, but these are not two teams that are just like, okay. I think it's pretty realistic right now to say that NA feels like the 3rd best region in the world, just in terms of how they've been playing the game, and I think this game kind of corroborates that take if you do want to go down that route. Obviously, you know, I'm not going to say that for certain. I'm not done my power rankings just yet, but you know, let's talk about game 2 before we get into any sort of major like region talk, before I piss everybody off, not just the people who are watching this video. Let's talk about what's actually happening here. First off, of course, talking about the draft. Kind of an interesting one. Certainly much more interesting than what we got in game number 1, where we saw a lot of more stock standard picks. There are a lot of very common picks in the meta right now, but I don't think either team necessarily indexed very heavily into one area or another. Pretty all around and like general in terms of how these comps were drafted. The one pick that I think is in just such a tremendous spot this game is Annie in the mid lane, and I know that feels like a very weird champion to highlight in any sort of draft, but honestly, how does Yone answer Annie in any, you know, capacity? He just gets stunned before any fight starts, and then I would imagine Annie ends up kind of running that laning phase. And also, like, generally Maokai is considered to be, you know, pretty bad to play into Annie. It's kind of tough to be able to pilot Maokai in the way that you normally would into a Tibbers or free stuns or anything like that. Like, she can just disrupt him frontlining quite as efficiently as maybe he would want to be able to. And so Annie's in a pretty strong spot here, and by proxy Trundle is in a pretty strong spot here. But outside of that, you're looking at a top lane matchup that's, you know, kind of even, at least in my opinion, in terms of how things go. You're looking at a bot lane matchup where neither is likely going to be able to take advantage of the other, because both want to go for a lot of these mid-game skirmishes, and so it's really just about who ends up winning a lot of these fights around the mid-game and whether or not you can get any pressure in the mid lane if you're Cloud9 in this one, and they did exactly that. They started winning a lot of the fights that really ended up mattering, and most specifically, Sven ended up really popping off once again in this game. He's going to get player of the game for game number 2. It's really cool to see this team trust that they can put, you know, the game in the hands of someone like Sven and, you know, let him carry, especially considering how much trust they put into him last time these two teams played off against each other. We talked about Sven maybe not coming up clutch in game number 5 of that previous series, but through the first game, he was really great. Even though the team lost, his positioning was really solid. He was dealing a ton of damage, and in this second game, once again, he was kind of the primary carry. He was the one that they were pumping a lot of the resources into, and he very much paid it out on the Ezreal. This is his classic pick. This is like the Neil's pick from back in the day. I remember him on Ezreal so many times on Origin, just being able to put in so much work, and, you know, obviously G2 and like that entire era of his older part of his career. It's cool to see him continue that legacy, I guess, here on Cloud9 in the finals once again, but he is stepping up big time so far at the beginning of this series, and part of that credit, once again, as I gave credit to Masu in game number 1, you have to give it to the supporting cast as well, like I gave it to Inspired and Busio, and I think Blabber and Vulcan in this case were absolutely tremendous in this game. Blabber's not going to get nearly enough credit for how he piloted this Maokai here. I don't think this is the most, like, efficient Maokai draft of all time. I think that there are a lot of things kind of pushing against Maokai being relevant in this game. Trundle obviously being able to steal a lot of his tank stats, and then all the CC, like all of the lockdown coming in on the other side. It's pretty easy to blow up something like a Maokai in a lot of these fights if you're not playing well, but he actually did a good job of being able to get early pressure onto the targets that he needed to, whether that be Sven or we'll talk about it, Thanatos in the top lane on this Mbessa, who really took over in the back end of some of these fights. But Blabber was excellent in this game, even if it's not necessarily going to stand out in terms of being like in your face, like carry oriented. He always plays these tank champions better than he plays plays a lot of the carries. Like, I liked him on the Wukong, but Maokai, Sejuani, like, these are the things that he plays at a really high level, and every single time he pilots one of these, it looks basically unstoppable. I don't understand why teams, let him have this, or alternatively, why Cloud9's not just taking this every single game if they get the opportunity to, because this is even into, again, not a great Maokai draft, in my opinion. Loki was solid in the mid lane, but the other member to shout out for Cloud9, at least in my opinion, is Thanatos on the top side, especially in the back end of some of these fights. I know Mbessa is kind of considered to be, kind of a weird champion in terms of where exactly her power lies and where her strengths end up, congregating. I consider Mbessa to be more lane dominant than she is team fight dominant if you're playing at a high level, but you land one good ultimate onto the back line, public execution onto the back line, it's kind of over. Like, you can still take over in these fights, and because she is a bruiser, if she ends up getting really far ahead, just like Cassante before her, she can 1v9 in a lot of circumstances, and Thanatos, I think, played these fights well. But Sven kind of the carry, Thanatos kind of the secondary backup carry in terms of the damage, and Blabber and Vulcan really setting things up. Again, Loki was totally fine into a bad matchup in the mid lane, but I don't think he was necessarily the one pushing the game forward. This was Cloud9 really playing around some unorthodox win conditions for them in particular and really making the most of it. And then for FlyQuest, on the other side, just not as good of a performance as Cloud9. Again, I think that they were doing a couple of things right in this game. I think they had pressure at times. Players like Inspired were attempting to push the game forward, but Cloud9 was just kind of outplaying them in some pretty big moments, and that was a huge issue for FlyQuest. It really felt like, mechanically speaking, they were on the back end, and I don't think it necessarily is the draft. I think the draft is not terrible here, but this comp does naturally fall off pretty hard in the late game. You don't really have anyone who can carry a team fight in the back half of this game. You're hoping and praying that Trundle stealing stats from Maokai can make him your big frontliner, and then Aatrox can kind of separate the Ezreal from the Mbessa and, make them play out the fights that way. That way, Annie and Lucian can maybe have enough damage to be able to break through, but outside of that win condition, like, if Annie and Lucian are what you're relying on to win team fights, 5v5s, it's really difficult to actually be able to play that out, and I don't really understand why they're drafting this. I'm not going to spoil anything for the rest of this series, but FlyQuest's questionable drafts, I think, are definitely going to be a recurring trend throughout the rest of this series. But Masu, for me, is going to get dud of the game. Didn't really get to do anything on this Lucian, especially in comparison to what we saw out of the Kai'Sa in game number 1. Like, there was a huge gap in terms of where the AD carries were at. I think even more so than almost any other lane. Like, Bwipo wasn't quite as relevant on the Aatrox. Part of that's not his fault, but bot lane was super out of control. Sven was super fed and was playing really well. And again, this kind of goes back to this idea that Sven is just better at generating resources in the early game than someone like Masu is, especially when left to their own devices. But Masu needs to be able to pilot these things more consistently, or they need to not pick things like Lucian Nami to try and answer in the bot lane. I think it ended up just being a bit of an anti-synergy in terms of what their playstyle is, and also it didn't really feel like they were ever going to be better than Sven and Vulcan in this game at that particular role. So Masu's going to get dead of the game, although I think Busio is up for debate in that regard as well. It's just that Masu contributed to basically nothing throughout this. Quad also kind of needed to be better, in my opinion, on the Annie, or at least more active around the map. I'm certainly not blaming him. I think he did try to do things, but FlyQuest felt like they were outplayed in this game, and I think that's what makes it so interesting going now into a game number 3 where we're tied up at 1 apiece. If FlyQuest can take this game 3 and we just flip-flop back and forth between blue side, then everything will kind of be as expected. If Cloud9 can pick up the win here and go up 2-1 in the series, you know how much easier it is to win a best of 5 when you only have to win one of the final 2 games instead of both? It would be a massive, massive win. You guys know I believe game 3 to be the most important in the entire series, especially when tied up at 1 apiece. And so this is big. Whoever takes it's going to be in a great spot. But who's that going to be? Well, the winner of game number 3 was Cloud9. They are going to take game number 3. They're going to go up for the first time in this series 2-1, and they're 1 game away from being able to do it, from being able to pull off what I think a lot would consider an upset, even if not a gigantic one, and pick up an LTA trophy to represent the region at MSI. Of course, they're not quite there yet, but being up 2-1 in a series like this is pretty massive, and especially winning game 3 on red side, a very big deal for Cloud9 and a very big loss for FlyQuest. And once again, I think you can look at almost the exact same problems that they ran into in game number 2, where their draft is just not really all that great. And, I'm going to say this, trust me, I'm trying not to spoil too much down the stretch of this series, but FlyQuest drafts throughout this entire series are very, very suspect. I think that there was a gigantic coach gap in this series in favor of Cloud9, and I think that came into effect in both games 2 and 3, which obviously, we'll talk about in depth here. But, like, man, man, FlyQuest just don't really know how to stop running in and dying at times. There are just, game states that they don't feel comfortable playing in. I know this team is very good from ahead, and they're typically pretty good from behind because their mechanics are so good that they can win, situations, and their aggressive tendencies can take advantage of mistakes that other teams make and kind of, force those mistakes upon them. But when the other team is just playing well, when they're doing all the things and checking off all the boxes, it's really hard for FlyQuest to be able to get away playing the greedy kind of style that they're pretty used to, and that's even with something like a Smolder scaling into the late game. So again, let's go ahead and talk about drafts. That's how we start these segments. Cloud9, once again, in my opinion, with a pretty big draft gap here, although I don't think it's quite as straightforward and direct as maybe you would, assume. I think mostly you're just looking at weird decisions coming in from FlyQuest. I think the idea of their draft in isolation is totally fine. I don't really have an issue with the way that they drafted if they weren't going into specifically what Cloud9 had already drafted, but that's the problem, right? This team comp just doesn't really have a lot of tools going into the late game that Cloud9 can't answer as efficiently. FlyQuest drafted Smolder, but they don't really have a scaling advantage. I shouldn't say they don't have a scaling advantage at all in this game because it's just Smolder that's going to be scaling into the late game. We'll talk about why that is when we get to the Cloud9 draft, but you look at C9, you look at Senna, obviously that's infinitely scaling. Orianna is definitely going to be, right up there in terms of damage that can be put out in the back half of the game, and then 3 frontliners, one of which in a Poppy who completely disrupts almost everything that FlyQuest wants to do. This is a disaster for Fly, in my opinion, and specifically because you see the Poppy get taken on R2, whether that's going to Blabber or Vulcan, you don't particularly care. Hell, Thanatos could probably play it on the top side as well. You don't particularly care where this thing is going to see that on R2, and to close out the second phase of your draft with Rakan, Xin Zhao on B4, B5, okay, great, you just picked 2 champions that aren't going to be able to fight in the later part of the game. What is going on? What is happening? Are we locked in on the same page? This just feels completely unacceptable for FlyQuest. It actually feels like them trolling away draft, and again, I don't even think they win in the late game, and that's with Smolder drafted on B3. It's just a disappointing draft coming in from FlyQuest. I don't really think they have a lot of avenues going into the back end of this draft, but even so, there is a way for them to win this game, and that's through the power of Xin Zhao Rise in the mid game. They still should be able to out-tempo anything that Cloud9 want to do in terms of these mid-game skirmishes, because even with Poppy being a really big nuisance in this game and being able to really take Xin Zhao out of it, if Xin Zhao can fight anywhere without Poppy there, and especially if Rise can realm warp in and you can get a lot of these big plays off, you can kind of get the Orianna or the Senna a little bit behind in the early game, you should be able to out-pressure them in that phase, but they couldn't do that because Blabber was the best player on the Rift in this game, and you can see that. Blabber's my player of the game for Game 3. I think a lot of people are going to give this to Sven down in the bot lane, and trust me, he was exceptionally good in this game on the Senna. Maybe not quite as good as he was in Game 2, in my opinion, on the Ezreal. I think from a mechanical perspective, he had to do a bit more in that second game, and he was even maybe a bit more challenged in that Game 1 as well, but he still was very important to this one. But they don't win this without Blabber. First of all, this Poppy is omega good in this draft. Not only does it, like I said earlier, shut down the Rakan and the Xin Zhao basically on its own throughout a lot of these 5v5s, which allows that scaling to be even more consistent, but it's able to take over in the early and mid game too, because as long as Blabber, keeps vision tracked on Inspired, the Xin Zhao mid game priority that he should be able to generate, it's not going to be nearly as easy with the Poppy being there to shut down a lot of that aggressive nature. And trust me, Blabber played phenomenal, not only in terms of where he was in the early game, but obviously in these late game team fights, and obviously when it comes to objective control. That's going to be a big story kind of surrounding this, is Blabber's ability to kind of outsmite or outplay Inspired in a lot of these objective scenarios, and that's gigantic. But even more so than just being able to secure objectives in this game, the Poppy was so useful in every aspect. This is just one of those picks that Cloud9's probably frustrated they can't play more in a best of 5 in this Fearless format, because it really did kind of set up everything that they wanted to do. And of course that helped enable the 12-1-15 or the 15-1-14 carry duo that you had on your team. We talk about the scaling advantage being in favor of Cloud9, and that's because I really believe in Orianna like that as a secondary carry. You add a Senna who's going to outrange this Smolder by a lot in the later half of the game. You add that on top of things become very difficult for FlyQuest to be able to win. Now, credit to them, they kept in this game for a very long time, and part of that was just how strong Masu ended up being on the Smolder. It really does feel like an AD carry battle right now in the finals, because both of them are playing some of the best League we've seen them play in quite a long time. But the setup was way better for Cloud9. You know, everybody else on Fly was kind of running it at times. I'm going to say specifically Bwipo, Inspired, Quad, and Busio. I guess it really is all four, right? Like, I can't specify one or two members more so than the others. All four of the other members of this team were actively running it and making terrible plays throughout parts of this game, and it really left Masu up to try and salvage the game, and he did so on multiple occasions, but eventually that's going to catch up to you. When you have 4 wards on this team and a Smolder, like, you can hold out for so long, but the Senna and the Orianna are eventually going to be able to push forward, and that's what happened. So Blabber, Loki, Sven, all playing really well. Vulcan, I thought, had a really good game on the Alistar. Maybe not quite as, like, playmaking oriented, maybe much more peel oriented, but still a very good one nonetheless. Thanatos was the only player that was making some mistakes for Cloud9. Once again, he's not playing his best series of his entire life right now in the finals. Certainly not what you want to see from him, but they're winning, and that's all that really matters. And, you know, for Cloud9, if you're going to have players like Blabber, Loki, and Sven step up and be the best players in their roles in the region, then yeah, like, you're probably going to be favorites in the finals, like you are, at least at the moment, with a 2-1 series lead. And then for Fly on the other side, like, it's just very clear where things went wrong. Dud of the game was honestly the only difficult thing to try and pick, because I think almost everybody on this team ended up really underperforming. I'm giving it to Inspired in the jungle because I do think the jungle gap was gigantic. In this game, the canyon was very large, and I think a lot of that was Inspired being greedy and picking the Xin Zhao late on in this draft. There was just no way for Xin Zhao to be able to play this game. Again, he needs to win these skirmishes in the mid game. He needs to be able to start stacking a lot of these objectives, and it just didn't really end up happening. It became, let's hope and pray that Smolder can win us this game, and that makes Xin Zhao and Rakan basically useless. By that proxy, Busio can basically get dead of the game here if you really wanted to give it to him. I just can't justify the Rakan. I know it's his best champion. Like, I know that as a player, that's what he's kind of known for, but this is not the game to ever pick this champion in. It really did not work out. They really could have used not only some peel in the back half of this game, but something that can play on the back end of these team fights, maybe an enchanter of some sort. It's just, the Rakan was not it, in my opinion. Quad had one of the worst realm warps I've ever seen in the back half of this game. Quad has really not been great through the first half of this series. I think he's definitely been outplayed by Loki. Games 2 and 3 were really bad from Quad, even if that doesn't show in my dead of the game calculator. And then, you know, Bwipo running it on Sion, that's just kind of a natural occurrence at this point. But really, like, for Fly, I think the core base of their problems are that drafting has been a huge problem for them across this entire series. Up until this point, they've been outdrafted arguably in all 3 games. In fact, I would argue in all 3 games they had a harder win condition, and it's really come back to bite them in games 2 and 3. And if that's going to continue, that is a major issue. And also, it just doesn't really feel like they respect Cloud9. They need to start playing as if Cloud9 can beat them from a neutral state. They're playing against them like they can just be better than them mechanically speaking, and that's a really hard thing to imagine. But Cloud9's up 2-1 right now. If they win this game number 4, not only are they taking this series and becoming your LTA North champions in kind of an upset, but they're representing the region at MSI, which of course they really, really want to do. So is Cloud9 going to be able to close this series out in 4 games, or will FlyQuest be able to pick up a win and send us to another Silver Scrapes game number 5 between these two teams? Well, the winner of game number 4 was FlyQuest. They are going to take game number 4. They're going to tie up this series at 2 apiece, and we are going to a Silver Scrapes game number 5 once again between these two teams. 2 back-to-back series for Fly where they go to 5, both against Cloud9, and honestly, they've had to earn it both times. It's definitely been a really fun matchup between these two teams, but once again, we are going to bring it down to one final game, and really, did we want it any other way between these two? This is exactly what we were looking for. Both of them have played pretty well here today, and you know what finally got FlyQuest across the finish line in terms of them being able to play out the back end of these games? A draft that they actually won. This is the first game in the series where I feel comfortable enough to say that Fly was better coming out of draft, and they absolutely executed on it despite what their players tried to do at certain points in the game. For Cloud9, I just don't think they have a lot of options in this one. I think their early game is good. Obviously, you're playing Pantheon Aurora. You should be able to, you know, set the tempo for how this game goes. Tristana is always going to be stronger than Corki in the early game, and you've got something like Jace to try and be able to pressure out some of these skirmishes. But at the end of the day, if you can't get that big lead in the early game, I don't really see you being able to fall back on anything, and Talia's going to be able to outroam Aurora. I think Cho'Gath can really just shut down the Jace and really kind of take away his big advantage in the early game, which is exactly what ended up happening regardless of how Bwipo ended up playing playing this game. Like, I just think you have less options as Cloud9, and this is a bad time for you to have your first draft in the series where I think you kind of took away your team's ability to win rather than gave your team more ability to win, I guess is the way that I want to put it. So I guess we can delve into exactly why I believe that is the case. First off, I do believe that FlyQuest has more options in the mid game in terms of being able to move around the map. Even if Cloud9, pre-6 especially, but really like, 10 plus, I guess pre-10 minutes into the game, they have more options in terms of what they want to do because Pantheon's going to be more active than Nocturne pre-6, and Aurora is going to be able to deal a ton of damage, and generally Jace is really good in that phase of the game as well. Like, you have things to do there. The moment that Nocturne hits level 6 and Talia hits level 6 and Cho'Gath starts building some tank items on the top side, all of a sudden a lot of that advantage starts to disappear like very quickly into this game because Talia's going to be able to roam faster than Aurora. Nocturne's going to be much more active on the map than something like Pantheon is because of his combat ability. I like Pantheon, and generally I would consider these two to be relatively even, but alongside the rest of this team, it's really hard to, find a world where the top side ends up breaking through. That being said, Tristana can still get a lot of resets in these fights, and Braum's going to be a bit of a problem in the bot lane as well because I do think he actually functions very well with the comp that's kind of structured on FlyQuest side. I really like that as an R4 for Vulcan in this game. Again, the problem is you just don't really have the tempo, and if mid lane's going to win, then that's a big problem, and Quad was unbelievable in this game, and that kind of, carries on to the rest of the draft talk where I do believe that FlyQuest ends up outscaling in terms of how these drafts go. If they're already going to have tempo in the mid game because you're playing around Nocturne to Leah and being able to kind of fight wherever you want at any given time, and you have like a Corki bailout. You have Cho'Gath who's going to get bigger and bigger theoretically as the game continues to go along, and it's not like Talia is going to fall off at being that secondary or tertiary carry. I don't love Talia when she's asked to be a number 1 or kind of a strong number 2 option, but when you've got something like Corki on the back line or on the back side of your fight, and then you've got Nocturne diving the back line, you've got Cho'Gath also being able to execute people, Talia kind of fits into that slot very nicely, and Quad obviously played this incredibly well. He's player of the game for game number 4. I saw a lot of people making comments after this 4th game that, oh, if FlyQuest wins this series, Quad better be finals MVP. Not so sure about that. Obviously, I've pushed back on that narrative quite a bit already. I think that would be entirely based off of game number 4, which I don't really love, but he did win them this game, which is huge. He kept them in this series, and it wasn't just him. Inspired had a really good game number 4 as well, and the Nocturne, I think those two in particular, the jungle mid duo, was kind of what drove Fly forward and kind of what held Cloud9 back, which we will talk about. Not that Loki was really all that terrible, but Thanatos and Blabber, the top side of the map, not their best game here in game number 4, but Quad being able to land some pretty fantastic seismic shoves in the back half of this game, and obviously the damage output coming in from this Talia being everywhere he needed to be. When you talk about a mid-game skirmish advantage, that's only as good as the players that are willing to take advantage of it, and Quad definitely did a great job doing that here today, and then like I said, Inspired also great moving around the map and creating opportunities for the team. I think Masu and Busio were also underratedly good. Masu's been awesome in this series. I don't think he's getting nearly enough credit. All that talk, that comment I saw about, oh, Quad's gonna get finals MVP if FlyQuest wins this. I don't know, man. Like, that's not necessarily how I'm looking at this series. I think Masu was once again really great, really stable on the Corki in the early game, especially because Tristana is really the point of power for Cloud9 throughout a lot of the mid game here. If they can win skirmishes around Tristana and Braum, that's kind of the way that they want to play out the mid game, at least from my perspective here. Masu playing safe, not really putting himself in any harm's way, and then doing a ton of damage in these late game team fights and even in these skirmishes once he hits level 6. Really impressive stuff. Busio was pretty solid considering the fact that he got counterpicked in the support position. Nautilus, not great into Braum because there's not really a ton you can do there, but really, the only negative I can give FlyQuest is Bwipo on the top side. And honestly, like, this was a 4v5 for Fly. There's almost nothing else left to say when Bwipo wasn't running it down, which he did at multiple points, just stepping up and dying for absolutely no reason. People like to defend Bwipo in side lanes on these instances where they're saying, like, oh, he's buying time and, playing weak side so that, they have to send resources to him to kill him, and then that baits the other team to do something, and it lets FlyQuest do something else elsewhere on the map. That's a great narrative that people are spinning. Bwipo dying in a side lane most of the time accomplishes basically nothing, and he's just greedy. Like, that's just part of his game. It's always been a part of his game, but I think the bigger concern for me is just how consistently he plays this Cho'Gath, and how consistently he just refuses to get stacks throughout the game, and by the time you hit the late game, he's like half as big as he should be in terms of the way things are going. I'm not sure if that's just like a conscious decision, or if he's just forgetting that he can kill minions, or he can go to, Void Grubs and take them. Like, I don't really know that he can do it on Dragon or whatever, right? Like, is he just forgetting that he can do it because he's often like running away from these situations in order to chase people for no reason and not getting his stacks like actively? It just feels very strange. change. Bwipo did not have a very good game here, and I do believe they won in spite of him rather than because of him. Some people might disagree with that down in the comment section below, but I think Inspired and Quad did a lot of the heavy lifting here. Masu was obviously really great in the back end of some of these fights, but, FlyQuest really relying on the players that were going to push them forward rather than it being like a full team effort, in my opinion. But for Cloud9, again, I just think you kind of took some options away from yourself. I think Jace Pantheon kind of really pigeonholes you into wanting to win early, especially pre-level 6. And once you hit level 6, you want to play the macro game, but you can't because Nocturne can match a lot of the global pressure that Pantheon ends up having. Nocturne's obviously not quite global, but semi-global enough to be able to react to a lot of it. And Talia is going to be more active in that zone than Aurora is, unless you're like really on the front foot. And again, you're only going to do that through the bot lane, in my opinion, in this game, because Cho'Gath just can't be taken advantage of on the top side in that way, unless Bwipo's running it down, which he did in the mid game. But again, I think this is the worst draft that Cloud9 has had. That being said, they were in this game. Like, they absolutely could have won it. Not only were they able to pick up some really big objectives, because that's been a huge priority, clearly, for Cloud9 in this series, be it Dragons or be it Baron. Like, it really felt like they continued to push forward. Like, they could, if they won a fight, if Aurora and Tristana were able to get, into a good position and be able to take down, Talia or, the Nocturne early on in a fight, like, they could absolutely have won this game. They just didn't do that. Quad landed a gorgeous seismic shove in the back half of the game, and it was just kind of over from there. 29 minutes, sub 30 is not indicative of how strong this game was from Cloud9. That being said, if you had a better draft, you win this game. I truly believe that. Right now, I think it's fair to say that Cloud9 is playing better than FlyQuest in this series. It just hasn't really mattered. Draft has actually mattered a ton in this series, and Thanatos being kind of a letdown on the top side. He was in the running for dead of the game. Blabber kind of being in the running for dead of the game, kind of letting his team down. Those things were a bit unfortunate in terms of the setups for C9, but all of that goes out the window because it is now do or die. It's Silver Scrapes game number 5 time. The winner of this will not only be representing the region alone at MSI, but will be your 2025 Spring Split champions here in the LTA North. Who is it going to be? Will it be Fly? Will it be Cloud9? Well, the winner of game number 5 was FlyQuest. They are going to take game number 5. They are going to take this series 3-2. And your 2025 Spring Split champions here in the LTA North are once again FlyQuest. I am so happy for this team, not particularly because of this game number 5, although this was a banger. And honestly, all that we're learning is that if it goes to 5 games in the finals and the game is remotely interesting or fun or has some creative, crazy ending, it's got to go FlyQuest's way. Going back to summer of last year, that was the case then. It's the case now here in game 5 here with a, backdoor and just generally chaos and a very even game that goes almost 50 minutes here in game number 5. Just everything you could possibly want out of a finale in a series like this. But even more so than that, these players are so clutch and their decision making in these big moments is so crystal clear, especially in comparison to basically every other Western team at this level. They just understand exactly what they're supposed to be doing. And that's with a draft like this. I'm gonna get into this, man. You picked Kha'Zix Elise in game number 5. Are you freaking kidding me? Like, you think you can get away with this and actually win the game? There's no shot. No shot. FlyQuest just won the LTA with Kha'Zix jungle and Elise support. I'm going to genuinely lose my mind. Unreal. But for Cloud9 on the other side, they played awesome in this series. And I honestly think that there is an argument that from a pure mechanics perspective, when everything was neutral, they were right there with FlyQuest. It's just the decision making that they had in some of these games, and also just, playing down the stretch. The longer these games went, the worse Cloud9 ended up getting in them. And that ended up being their downfall in this series, but they played awesome. And the fact that this team isn't going to MSI is absolutely, utterly ridiculous. I'm going to say something right here that I kind of alluded to earlier on in the video, and, I'm sure there's going to be people that are watching this that completely disagree. I know, because I got some comments on the previous video that, we're talking about how low the quality is in NA. I'm going to go on a bit of a tangent, a bit of a rant here. If you want to skip like 2 minutes in, I think that's entirely fine, but I do want to get this out of my system. This idea that NA is dying or that NA esports is getting worse has only propagated that into becoming reality. Like, you can argue that the NA ecosystem is dying, and I would agree with you. I think that there is a lot, going wrong, and, there are a lot of things that are being taken apart. We're losing a lot of money. A lot of the interest is going down. The viewership is going down, yada, yada, yada. There's a ton of stuff going on with North American League of Legends right now, but at the end of the day, in terms of raw on-the-Rift production, can you say that we are not better right now than we have been at almost any point in the last couple of years? And even longer than that, like, has NA NA not just been what EU has been over the past like 3 years? Like K-Corp made first stand finals, absolutely, that's their big accomplishment, but Team Liquid beat them at that tournament. I think that that's a fair thing to point out. Before that, really the only tournament where EU ended up outperforming NA was MSI 2024, where G2 ended up in final 3 or final 4, something like that, and NA obviously didn't end up getting that far. But outside of that, you look at the quarterfinals of Worlds this past year, who was there? NA. Who was not there? EU. You look at the quarterfinals of Worlds in 2023, who is in the quarterfinals? NA. Who is not? EU. And I get that that's not everything. I'm not trying to sit here and pretend like NA is guaranteed to be better than Europe, but this idea that NA is dying and that the talent is getting worse and that the teams are getting worse and that nobody's playing well for North America and they're just going to disappoint internationally, this is a self-created cycle in North America. The only reason that that narrative exists is because of something that happened 6 years ago, and the fact that people haven't been able to adapt just goes to show that NA fans don't want their region to succeed. They want to complain. They want to sit there and talk about how the region is dying, about how the teams are getting worse. What I just watched in the finals here today are two teams that are probably better than anybody in Europe. Like, I really do believe that right now. I'm not saying that that's the version of them that we're going to get at MSI. I'm not sitting here and saying that FlyQuest is going to go to that tournament and be able to destroy Movistar Koi or G2 or whatever, but this idea that NA has like fallen off in terms of what their high-end upside can look like, I just don't believe it. Like, I really genuinely do not believe that that is the case. And I think this series showcased the best of what NA has to offer. The depth, is it there? No. But the top-end talent, is it there? Yes. FlyQuest at their best is a top 8 team in the world. And I don't know if you can say that for a lot of NA teams in the past. And so I'm just getting frustrated. Like, I know I tend to be a bit of an NA homer, but like, I'm not trying to be biased in this case. I've been anti-NA in the past when they've deserved it, and I've been pro-NA when they've deserved it. They deserve it right now. This entire region has been playing fine. FlyQuest and Cloud9 in particular are very, very good teams, and I don't want the narrative coming out of this to be like, oh, NA is a clown fiesta and nothing is going right and the region is dying and the teams and players suck and, you know, all of this, yada, yada, yada. I absolutely believe that right now there is a chance that this version of FlyQuest is the best North American team we've had in a very long time in terms of the production they actually have, because they have the mechanics and they have the execution. And even on top of that, I think a team like Cloud9 could also probably compete internationally. And so, again, I'm just going to stake my claim. We'll see if that ages incredibly poorly. There are going to be people who yell at me in the comments section if they really disagree with that take, but I wanted to go on a bit of a tangent because I do believe it's worth talking about that NA is just, it's not nearly as doomer as people want to make it out to be. It's 90% narrative at this point, which I really just don't like. Again, I'm not agreeing with any of the changes. I think that the region format is really stupid. I think the merging of the LTA North and South was very dumb and it really held back North America, and it's clear that money and viewership are leaving, but that has nothing to do with the actual performance on the Rift, and I think the performance on the Rift right now has actually been pretty good, not only this year, but over the past couple of years, and I think this series goes to prove that there's real talent here, man. Fly was awesome in this game. Cloud9 was awesome in this game, and I think you can even talk about that with some weird drafts. I don't really like the cohesion on either of these drafts, I should say, not any of these drafts, either of these drafts. I think Cloud9 don't really have a part of the game that they're actually good in. Like, you're hoping that Hui can take over in the late game, and Jarvan can be kind of a propagator for that. Kalista wants to win early. Just feels like there's a ton of disconnect in terms of exactly where they want to spike at any point in the game, even if they do have some okay laning phases. And for Fly, while they're much more direct in terms of how they want to play, you have the traditional Caitlyn curve, as I like to call it, where the mid game is going to plummet for this team. You're not really going to be able to skirmish around 2 items nearly as efficiently as almost anybody else in the game, but you are going to be able to team fight later on because Caitlyn and Victor are going to be online, and your early game's crazy. You have Caitlyn Elise as a bot lane duo. You have Kha'Zix running around, like, creating a lot of chaos. Like, there are parts of this game where FlyQuest end up being positive. The problem is, like, all of this being kind of put on the test in Game 5, champions that I just inherently believe are worse, regardless of what they're good at. You know, champions like Elise in the support position, or Kha'Zix in the jungle, even something like a Caitlyn in the bot lane. Champions that I think are just inherently worse at doing the things that they're supposed to do than other champions at this level. For you to pick those things in Game 5 and actually be able to win on it, just insane. And player of the game and player of the series for me, maybe this is also against the grain, but again, I've had against the grain takes all year long in the LTA. Player of the series is absolutely Modern Masu. Like, Finals MVP was not close in my eyes. Credit to Quad. I do think he played well throughout this series. I'm not trying to take anything away from him, but they don't win this series without Masu. Not only did he, dominate game number 1 for them, he was really great in that game. He was pretty solid in game 4, and yes, Quad was probably better there, but he was the best player on the Rift here in game number 5. He almost won them game 3 on the Smolder as well. Like, to me, it's a no-brainer. Masu is your Finals MVP, and the reason this is so important is because Masu has been a player that, while he has been good, he's not been great. He's not necessarily played like an MVP candidate throughout this year, like maybe we were expecting in terms of his development curve, but this Finals kind of showcases that he can be the number 1 option for Fly in these big best of 5s and come through just like he did against Gen G in Worlds last year, at Worlds last year in the quarterfinals. So credit to Masu. I want to give him all the credit in the world. He even pulled Blabber's aggro enough to allow FlyQuest to win the game. Like, I know that's not necessarily him, and that's more so, C9 and Blabber generally making mistakes and overextending, but, like, it's still great. Like, Masu still was the most relevant player in this game. Quad was very good on the Victor. I certainly don't want to take anything away from what Quad did, and obviously he won them the game. Like, him, Bwipo, the shot calling of Inspired and Busio, like, all of it won the game here, but Masu to me was the most relevant, and Quad was a close second place. He is in consideration for Finals MVP, but really to me, like, this was Masu's award to lose, and he did not lose it. Quad was still great, and again, the Victor was huge, but to me, this was an obvious decision. The fact that Busio ends up winning a Finals on Elise support makes me furious and frustrated. The fact that anybody can find success on this champion makes me irritated because I just do not like it. I do not like watching it at a pro level, but Busio was, Elite support in this game, causing a lot of chaos and havoc early on in the game, even later on in the game, ends up bugging out Cloud9 and giving them, the feats of warfare, which obviously I'm barely going to touch upon here because it didn't end up mattering, but, Cloud9 ends up getting the feats of warfare when they don't really deserve it because of the spiderlings and the interaction coming in from that champion. Very weird stuff, but Busio ends up being relevant enough to still be able to win the game. Inspired was not particularly relevant on the Kazakhs until he was, which is crazy. Not really how that champion's supposed to go. And Bwipo, obviously, on the Gragas was also, generally along for the ride, but made big plays in the back half of the game. It's like, you know what I mean? Like, it all just kind of came down to the wire, and everybody on Fly had to step up when it mattered the most, and that's exactly what they did here. Backdoor win, crazy finish, awesome stuff for Fly. And for Cloud9, the real crime here is that this team isn't going international. I really do believe that there is an argument that they are better than both of the representatives coming out from Europe, and they lost this series, and just is what it is. Sven played out of his freaking mind in this series. I think he just set a record for most kills in a losing best of 5 ever. That might be in any major region. That might be in any region ever. I think he had like 47 kills in this series or something like that, and he lost. Like, absolutely ridiculous coming in. Sven was the guy that was carrying this team on his shoulders throughout the entirety of this series. Not the only one, but certainly the one that was doing it the most. I think Vulcan, definitely should take some credit for that as well, but Sven was the main character for Cloud9. Unfortunately, Masu just outdueled him on the other side. Both 80 carries were exceptionally good today, and Masu was just the one who was going to be able to make it work the most. Unfortunately, you have to give a dud of the game as well. That's going to go to Blabber in the jungle. Just some questionable decision-making in the back half of this game, and that's kind of what's held Blabber back. For a player that has been so successful and so consistent at this level, who's won multiple titles, who's won multiple MVPs, for him to constantly make these big mental errors in these big moments is very concerning, and, it's just kind of what Blabber has become at this point in his career. I like him on things like Jarvan, but the moment that things like Maokai or Sejuani or Poppy, these more consistent facilitators get taken off the board, you can see that aggressive nature in his brain get triggered and get turned, get the switch flipped onto more aggressive, and things don't work out when he necessarily does that, and it just can be a bit frustrating. I don't think Thanatos was particularly good here today. He was more of a afterthought than anything else. I think the Mbessa game is the one game where you're looking at and seeing him do a lot of fun things, but that was more so isolated to the back half of the game as well. Just not really one of those superstar performances from a player that a lot of people need to see be a superstar in Thanatos. Loki was fine. Quad was probably better in this series, but Loki's wins were totally, great. That he wasn't the problem here. It's just Sven was the best player for Cloud9, and Masu was slightly better on the other side. Quad was slightly better than Loki, and that's the kind of stuff that really separates a team like FlyQuest, and that's what's going to be getting them to MSI. Congrats to, Fly. I'm so sorry to Cloud9 fans. This is a miserable way to go out in the spring split, but keep your head held up high. Not only are you still qualifying for the Esports World Cup, as much as you want to care about that tournament, which I think is kind of up for debate, but You know, not only that, but you've proven that you can hang with upper tier teams. If you can just keep this form up, there is a very real chance that you can still be the #1 team in North America by the end of the year and make a difference internationally. But Fly is going to get the chance to prove that they can do it right now. They're going to be going to MSI, no play-ins required. They're going to be slotted immediately into the main stage, and they have more than earned it. This is the best team in North America, and they came out and really proved that here today. All right, but that is going to do it for my LTA North Finals overview and analysis video, and that's going to do it for the spring split coverage here in the LTA North. Congratulations once again to FlyQuest, your 2025 spring split champions, and I'm hopeful that this team is going to be able to make an impact internationally. Again, I'm not going to try to spoil anything. I don't even know if I'm going to rank them above a lot of the teams that are going to be around them in terms of skill level, but they certainly made a strong case throughout not only this series, but their entire playoff run that they deserve to be considered one of, if not the best team in the West right now. They have everything going for them, and I'm excited to see what they can do, but that's going to do it. Please let me know if you agree or disagree with my takes. I spouted some pretty hot ones in today's video, so curious to know where you guys land down in the comments section below, but also let me know if you enjoyed it. Leave a like if you did. It really does mean a lot, but let me know down in the comments whether or not you enjoyed the format, whether you enjoyed the analysis, and whether or not you're excited for MSI. That content's going to be coming out very, very shortly, and that's on top of the fact that, you know, the LCK already wrapped up as well. That's the final region we have left to do in terms of the final series. We'll be covering that in a video tomorrow, and then it's all MSI from then on out. It's the meta report, it's the primer and power rankings video, and then it's every single day of MSI covered on this channel as per usual, as we do every single year. So if you're excited for that, hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all